The morning mist still clung to the pasture when I first noticed Beatrice acting strange. She was our oldest sow, a massive Yorkshire with intelligent eyes that seemed to hold secrets. For 3 days straight, she had been digging in the same spot near the old shed, her snout covered in fresh earth, her determination unwavering. I stood at the kitchen window, coffee growing cold in my hands, watching her massive form root around in what should have been unremarkable ground. The shed had been there since before I was born, its weathered boards gray with age and neglect. Father had always kept it locked, claiming it held nothing but old farming equipment too broken to use but too valuable to throw away. Beatrice snorted and dug deeper, her powerful legs churning up clods of dark soil. Something about her behavior unsettled me. Pigs were intelligent creatures, but this seemed different, purposeful in a way that made my skin crawl. She wasn't foraging for food or making a wallow. She was searching for something specific. The October wind rattled the windows as I pulled on my work boots. Father had been dead for 6 months now, and I'd inherited the farm along with all its mysteries. The shed was just one of many things he'd never explained. One of many silences that had defined our relationship. Maybe it was time to see what had captured Beatrice's attention so completely. As I walked across the frost-stiffened grass, she looked up at me with those knowing eyes, dirt caked around her snout like some primitive war paint. For a moment I could have sworn she was trying to tell me something. The hole she'd dug was already knee-deep and growing. The shovel felt heavy in my hands as I approached the excavation site. Beatrice had wandered off to her feeding trough, leaving behind a crater that seemed to pulse with possibility. I'd tried to dismiss her behavior as simple pig instinct, but something about the precise location bothered me. It was exactly 12 feet from the shed's eastern wall, close enough to be significant, far enough to be deliberate. I'd grown up on this farm, played in every corner of its 160 acres, yet this patch of ground had never seemed special before. Father had always steered me away from this area when I was young, claiming the ground was unstable or that there might be old well casings buried beneath. Now, staring into Beatrice's handiwork, those explanations felt hollow. The first shovelful of dirt came up easily, black earth mixed with clay that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. With each scoop, I found myself thinking about Father's last days in the hospital, how he'd rambled about things that needed to be set right, and debts that required payment. The nurses had attributed it to medication, but I'd seen the fear in his eyes, fear that had nothing to do with dying. 3 feet down, my shovel struck something that wasn't dirt or rock. The metallic clang sent vibrations up through the handle and into my bones. I dropped to my knees, brushing away loose soil with trembling hands. The corner of something square and metallic emerged from the earth, its surface tarnished but intact. A metal box, approximately the size of a briefcase, lay buried in what had once been carefully excavated ground. The soil around it was different, looser, as if it had been disturbed and replaced sometime in the past. My heart hammered against my ribs as I cleared more dirt away, revealing rusted hinges and a corroded but functional latch. The metal box came free with surprising ease, as if the earth itself was eager to give up its secret. It was heavier than I'd expected, dense with whatever lay inside. The surface was pitted with rust, but I could make out traces of what had once been green paint. This wasn't some forgotten farming equipment or discarded household item. This had been buried with purpose. I carried it to the shed's covered porch, my legs unsteady beneath the weight of discovery. The October sun had burned away the morning mist, but shadows still clung to the structure like guilty thoughts. The padlock on the shed door was newer than the building itself, installed sometime after my childhood explorations had ended. Another mystery Father had taken to his grave. Setting the box down on a weathered bench, I examined the latch mechanism. It wasn't locked, merely corroded shut by years of underground moisture. A few careful taps with a hammer, and it gave way with a groan that seemed almost human. My hands hesitated on the lid. Some discoveries changed everything, and there was no going back once the truth was revealed. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas that had protected its contents from decades of dampness, lay a collection of items that made my blood run cold. Photographs, dozens of them, showed scenes that belonged in police evidence files rather than family albums. Documents bore official seals and dates from 23 years ago. And at the bottom, wrapped in a separate piece of cloth, lay something that glittered in the afternoon light. The photographs told a story I wasn't prepared to hear. They showed a car accident scene, twisted metal, broken glass, emergency vehicles with their lights painting the darkness in urgent reds and blues. But these weren't the kind of pictures taken by accident investigators or insurance adjusters. These were taken by someone who had been there before the authorities arrived. Someone who had seen what really happened. My hands shook as I spread the photographs across the shed's porch. Each image revealed another piece of a puzzle I'd never known existed. The accident had happened on Highway 41, just outside Millbrook, a stretch of road I'd driven hundreds of times without ever knowing it held such significance to my family's history. The car in the pictures was a late-model sedan, its front end wrapped around an ancient oak tree that still stood sentinel by the roadside. But what made my stomach lurch wasn't the violence of the crash itself. It was the timestamp on the photographs and the meticulous way they'd been taken. Someone had documented every angle, every detail, with the thoroughness of a professional investigator. The documents underneath told an even stranger story. Police reports, witness statements, insurance forms, all bearing signatures I didn't recognize and case numbers that seemed to reference an investigation that had been quietly closed. The victim was listed as Margaret Sullivan, age 34, survived by a husband and young daughter. The cause was listed as driver error, possibly involving alcohol, though the toxicology report seemed incomplete. But it was the final item that made everything else fall into a terrible kind of sense. Wrapped in velvet cloth was a woman's wedding ring, its gold band engraved with initials that weren't my mother's. MS loves RS forever. Margaret Sullivan. The ring was accompanied by a handwritten note in Father's careful script. She was going to tell them everything. I couldn't let that happen. God forgive me. The implications hit me like a physical blow. My father, the man who'd raised me to value honesty above all else, had been involved in someone's death. Margaret Sullivan hadn't died in a simple accident. She'd been murdered, and the evidence of that crime had been buried in our backyard for over 2 decades, waiting for a persistent pig to uncover the truth. I couldn't concentrate on anything else for the rest of the day. The box sat in my kitchen like a malignant tumor, its contents spread across the table in careful rows. Each photograph seemed to reveal new details. A license plate number, a piece of debris that shouldn't have been there, shadows that suggested someone else had been at the scene. The police report was dated October 15, 2001. I would have been 15 then, old enough to remember if something significant had happened to Father around that time. Thinking back, I recalled that autumn as the season when he'd become distant and prone to long silences. He'd started drinking more, working later, avoiding the family dinner table whenever possible. Mother had attributed it to financial stress. The farm had been struggling that year, but now I wondered if there had been a darker reason for his behavior. Margaret Sullivan's name meant nothing to me, but a quick internet search revealed fragments of her story. She'd been a bookkeeper for several local businesses, divorced with a 10-year-old daughter named Sarah. The obituary was brief, clinical in its description of the tragic accident that had claimed her life. There was no mention of suspicious circumstances or ongoing investigations. But buried in the archived local newspaper coverage, I found something that made my blood run cold. Margaret Sullivan had been scheduled to testify in a federal corruption case involving county officials and construction contracts. The hearing had been set for the week following her death. Without her testimony, the case had quietly collapsed, and several prominent local figures had avoided prosecution. Father's construction company had been awarded 3 major county contracts that year, projects that had transformed our family's financial situation from struggling to comfortable. The timing couldn't have been coincidental. Margaret Sullivan had possessed information that could have destroyed my father's business and sent him to prison. Instead, she'd died on a dark country road, and her secrets had died with her. The shed's padlock yielded to bolt cutters with less resistance than I'd expected. Inside, 23 years of dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through gaps in the weathered boards. What I found there confirmed my worst fears and revealed new horrors I hadn't imagined. The space was larger than it appeared from outside, extending back into shadows where Father had constructed a makeshift office. A desk, filing cabinets, and a wall covered with photographs and documents. It was like discovering a secret room in a house I'd lived in my entire life. This wasn't storage for broken farm equipment. This was a command center for activities I was only beginning to understand. The filing cabinets contained records going back decades, Construction contracts, yes, but also correspondence with individuals whose names I recognized from newspaper crime reports. Payment schedules for services that were never clearly defined. Bank statements showing regular deposits and withdrawals that didn't correspond to any legitimate business activities. My father hadn't just been involved in Margaret Sullivan's death. He'd been running some kind of operation that touched multiple aspects of county corruption. But it was the wall of photographs that truly horrified me. Pictures of people in compromising situations, documents that should have been confidential, evidence of activities that could destroy careers and lives. My father had been a blackmailer, using his construction business as a front for gathering information and leveraging it for profit. Margaret Sullivan hadn't just known about county corruption, she'd known about father's role in it. Among the photographs, I found images of Margaret Sullivan taken without her knowledge. Pictures of her leaving work, entering her apartment, meeting with federal investigators. Father had been watching her, documenting her activities, preparing for what he must have known would eventually happen. The final photographs in the sequence showed her car leaving her apartment complex on the night she died. Sleep was impossible that night. Every sound seemed amplified. The house settling, wind through the trees, the distant lowing of cattle. I'd moved the evidence box to my bedroom, unable to leave it unattended even though I wasn't sure who might come looking for it. The paranoia felt justified given what I'd discovered about father's activities. Around midnight, headlights swept across my bedroom window. A car was turning into the farm's long driveway, moving slowly with its lights dimmed. I grabbed the shotgun from my closet and positioned myself where I could see the approach without being visible from outside. The vehicle stopped near the house but didn't shut off its engine. Two figures emerged, moving with the practiced stealth of people accustomed to midnight work. They headed directly for the shed, confirming my suspicion that someone else knew about father's hidden activities. I watched through night vision binoculars as they examined the broken padlock and peered into the dark interior. Their conversation was too distant to hear, but their body language suggested disappointment and growing urgency. They spent 20 minutes searching the shed before turning their attention to Beatrice's excavation site. Even in the darkness, the disturbed earth was obvious. One of them knelt beside the hole, running his hands through the loose soil as if hoping to find something I'd missed. Their search was thorough and professional. These weren't casual trespassers or opportunistic thieves. When they finally left, I memorized their license plate number and waited until dawn before venturing outside. Fresh footprints in the soft earth confirmed what I'd witnessed, and I found cigarette butts near the shed that hadn't been there before. Someone was very interested in what father had hidden, and they weren't going to give up easily. The question was whether they were looking for the same evidence I'd found, or something even more damaging. The license plate belonged to a rental car from Millbrook, paid for with a credit card registered to a company that didn't officially exist. I'd learned enough about father's methods to recognize the signs of a front operation. Whoever had visited my farm last night was connected to the same network that had employed my father's services for over 2 decades. I spent the morning researching Margaret Sullivan's family, trying to understand why her death still mattered 23 years later. Her daughter Sarah had grown up to become an investigative journalist, working for newspapers in 3 different states before landing at a major metropolitan daily. Her specialty was exposing corruption in small-town government, exactly the kind of work her mother had been doing when she died. Sarah's recent articles included a series about unsolved murders in rural counties, cases where potential witnesses had died in convenient accidents before they could testify. The series had been running for 6 months, and each installment seemed to get closer to the truth about systematic corruption and witness elimination. Her mother's case hadn't been mentioned yet, but I suspected it was only a matter of time. The federal investigation that Margaret Sullivan had been scheduled to participate in might have died with her, but the underlying corruption had continued. Father's records showed payments and activities extending right up until his final illness. The network he'd been part of was still active, still eliminating threats to their operations. That's why someone had come looking for his files. They were afraid of what he might have documented about their activities. I realized I was now in possession of evidence that could expose decades of criminal activity. The photographs, financial records, and correspondence I'd found could destroy multiple careers and send dozens of people to prison. But it could also get me killed, just like Margaret Sullivan. The people who had visited my farm weren't going to simply forget about what father might have left behind. Finding Sarah Sullivan wasn't difficult. Investigative journalists maintained public profiles by necessity. What surprised me was how much she resembled the woman in Father's surveillance photographs. The same determined expression, the same defiant set to her shoulders. She'd inherited more than just her mother's appearance. She'd inherited her sense of justice. I called her newsroom that afternoon, claiming to have information about her mother's death. The conversation was brief but intense. She'd been investigating the accident for years, slowly building a case that it hadn't been accidental. She knew about the federal corruption case, the convenient timing, the incomplete investigation. What she didn't know was that evidence still existed. We agreed to meet at a public location, a diner 50 miles from the farm where neither of us would be recognized. I brought copies of everything, leaving the originals hidden in a new location. If something happened to me, I'd arranged for the evidence to be sent to 3 different news organizations and the FBI. It was insurance that might keep us both alive long enough for the truth to come out. Sarah was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s, with her mother's intense green eyes and a bearing that suggested she'd inherited Margaret's courage, along with her investigative instincts. She listened to my story without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification, but never expressing disbelief. When I finished, she sat quietly for several minutes, processing the implications. "I always knew someone had helped cover it up," she finally said. "The accident scene was too clean, the investigation too brief. But I never imagined the evidence still existed." She studied the photographs with professional detachment, but I could see the pain in her eyes. These weren't just case files to her. They were images of her mother's final moments, preserved by the man who had arranged her death. We spent 3 hours going through everything, with Sarah taking notes and asking questions that revealed the depth of her own investigation. She'd identified most of the players in the corruption network, tracked their activities across multiple counties, even discovered other suspicious deaths that followed the same pattern. What she'd lacked was proof, the kind of evidence that could stand up in court and convince prosecutors to act. Working with Sarah Sullivan felt like betraying my father's memory, but I couldn't ignore the evidence of what he'd done. The corruption network he'd served stretched across 3 counties and involved judges, prosecutors, construction companies, and local politicians. Margaret Sullivan had been just one victim in a decades-long pattern of witness elimination and evidence suppression. Sarah's investigation had identified 12 other cases where potential witnesses or whistleblowers had died in convenient accidents. Car crashes, house fires, hunting accidents, drownings, all carefully staged to look accidental, all occurring just before testimony or evidence was scheduled to be presented. The pattern was consistent enough to be deliberate, but subtle enough to avoid triggering federal investigation. Father's records provided the missing piece of the puzzle. He hadn't just been a participant in the network. He'd been their primary operative for witness elimination. The construction business had been a perfect cover, providing legitimate reasons to travel throughout the region and access to equipment that could stage accidents. His reputation for honesty had made him above suspicion, the last person anyone would suspect of murder. The financial records showed payments totaling nearly $2 million over 20 years, far more than his construction business could have generated legitimately. Each payment corresponded to the death of someone who had posed a threat to the network's activities. Margaret Sullivan's murder had earned him $50,000, the price of a mother's life and a daughter's future. But the records also revealed something else. The network was preparing to eliminate Sarah Sullivan. Her investigation had gotten too close to the truth, and they'd decided she was too dangerous to live. Surveillance reports in Father's files showed they'd been watching her for months, documenting her activities and relationships, preparing for what they euphemistically called accident intervention. We had perhaps days before they acted. Sarah's latest article was scheduled to run in 3 days, and the network's previous patterns suggested they would strike just before publication. We needed to move quickly, get the evidence to people who could act on it, and ensure Sarah's safety before the network realized how much we knew. The FBI field office in Birmingham was our best option, but getting there safely required careful planning. Sarah's editor had already been contacted by people claiming to represent the subjects of her investigation, people who had made subtle threats about the consequences of publishing unsubstantiated allegations. The network knew she was close to exposing them, and they were preparing to act. I moved the original evidence to 3 separate locations, creating a dead man's switch that would automatically release everything if something happened to either of us. The copies we carried were enough to start an investigation, but the originals contained details that could convict dozens of people and expose the full scope of the conspiracy. We couldn't afford to lose them to violence or legal maneuvering. The drive to Birmingham felt like a journey through enemy territory. Every car that stayed behind us too long, every rest stop where strangers seemed to pay too much attention, could be a sign that we'd been discovered. Sarah drove while I monitored our surroundings, both of us hyper-aware that we were carrying information that powerful people would kill to suppress. Special Agent Martinez listened to our story with professional skepticism that gradually transformed into grim determination. She'd worked corruption cases before and recognized the signs of institutional capture we described. The evidence we provided was more comprehensive than anything she'd seen. Financial records, photographs, correspondence, and witness elimination lists that spanned 2 decades of criminal activity. But even as we spoke, Martinez received a call that chilled my blood. Sarah's apartment had burned down that morning, just hours after we'd left for Birmingham. The fire department was calling it an electrical problem, but the timing was too convenient to be coincidental. The network was moving against her, probably assuming she was still in the city and unaware of the danger. We were officially under FBI protection now, but that didn't mean we were safe. The corruption we'd exposed included law enforcement officials who had access to federal databases and communication systems. Martinez arranged for us to be moved to a secure location while the investigation began, but she warned us that prosecuting this case would take months or years. We were going to be looking over our shoulders for a long time. The safe house was a nondescript ranch home in a suburban neighborhood where federal witnesses waited for trials that might never come. Sarah and I spent weeks there, going through Father's records with FBI analysts who specialized in organized crime and public corruption. Every document, every photograph, every financial transaction had to be verified and connected to specific criminal acts. The investigation expanded rapidly as agents followed leads to other states and federal agencies. The corruption network we'd exposed was larger than anyone had imagined, with connections to construction contracts, environmental permits, judicial appointments, and law enforcement hiring. Father's records provided evidence of systematic criminality that had operated for decades without detection. But justice moved slowly, complicated by the network's influence within the system itself. 3 judges recused themselves from the case due to conflicts of interest. 2 prosecutors were transferred to other jurisdictions after irregularities were discovered in their handling of previous cases. Defense attorneys filed motion after motion, challenging every piece of evidence and questioning the credibility of witnesses who had been dead for years. Sarah used the time to write a book about her investigation, telling the story of her mother's murder and the conspiracy that had covered it up. Publishers were initially reluctant. The legal liability was enormous, and some of the subjects were still politically influential. But as FBI arrests began and federal indictments were unsealed, interest grew. The story was too important to suppress. I struggled with my own role in the narrative. Father had been a murderer, but he'd also been the man who taught me to fish, helped with homework, attended every school play and graduation ceremony. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could someone live 2 such completely different lives? The evidence was undeniable, but the emotional truth remained elusive. The first trial began 18 months after our meeting with Agent Martinez. Former County Commissioner Robert Hayes was charged with racketeering, conspiracy, and accessory to murder in connection with Margaret Sullivan's death. The evidence was overwhelming, but his defense team argued that my father had been acting independently, that the network hadn't authorized or known about the murder. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Commissioner Hayes received a life sentence without parole, and his conviction opened the floodgates for additional prosecutions. Over the next 2 years, 47 people were indicted on charges ranging from racketeering to murder conspiracy. Father's records had exposed a criminal enterprise that had operated with virtual impunity for over 2 decades. Sarah's book became a bestseller, sparking national conversations about corruption in rural America and the systematic elimination of witnesses who threatened powerful interests. She won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigative reporting, recognition that her mother would have been proud to see. The Margaret Sullivan Foundation was established to support investigative journalism in small communities, where local corruption often went unchallenged. I testified in 17 trials, describing how I'd discovered the evidence and what it revealed about Father's activities. Each testimony was emotionally exhausting, forcing me to relive the moment when my understanding of my family's history had been shattered. But I owed it to Margaret Sullivan and the other victims to tell the truth about what had happened. The farm became impossible to maintain during the years of trials and testimony. I sold it to a young family who promised to care for Beatrice and the other animals. They didn't know about the property's dark history, and I saw no reason to burden them with knowledge they didn't need. Some truths were better left buried, though others, as I'd learned, had a way of demanding exposure. Beatrice died peacefully in her sleep 2 years after the trials ended, having lived longer than any pig had a right to expect. The veterinarian said she'd simply worn out, her body finally surrendering to age and a lifetime of hard work. I like to think she'd lived long enough to see justice done for the woman whose grave she'd helped reveal. Even pigs, it seemed, had their own sense of right and wrong. The network's influence died hard, but it did eventually die. Federal oversight of county contracts became permanent, with independent monitors ensuring that the old corruption couldn't return. New prosecutors and judges, vetted by FBI background checks, slowly rebuilt public trust in the justice system. It would take generations to fully repair the damage, but the process had finally begun. I moved to a small city where no one knew my family's history, taking a job with a construction company that specialized in historic preservation rather than new development. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was spending my days restoring things that had been damaged by time and neglect, trying to undo the kind of destruction that Father had spent his life enabling. Sarah and I remained friends, bound together by our shared experience of discovering terrible truths about people we'd loved. She continued her investigative work, focusing on cases where justice had been delayed or denied. Her mother's story had taught her that some secrets were too dangerous to keep hidden, no matter how much pain their revelation might cause. As I write this, 5 years have passed since Beatrice first began digging near the shed. The physical evidence of Father's crimes has been processed through the courts and stored in federal archives, but the emotional evidence remains fresh in my memory. I still dream about that October morning when a pig's determination changed everything I thought I knew about my family. The truth, I've learned, has its own weight and momentum. Once exposed to light, it becomes impossible to rebury. Father had tried to keep his secrets hidden beneath tons of earth and decades of silence, but ultimately, even a pig could sense that something was wrong. Justice may be blind, but it's also patient, and sometimes it comes with a snout covered in dirt and a determination that won't be denied. The graves we dig for our secrets are never deep enough. The earth itself remembers what we try to forget, and sooner or later, someone or something will come digging for the truth. In our case, it was a pig named Beatrice who refused to let the dead rest in peace until justice had been served. Thank you for listening to this story of secrets uncovered and justice finally served. I hope it reminds you that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of surfacing when the time is right. Please let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I love hearing from people all around the world who appreciate stories about courage and the pursuit of justice. And if you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to the channel for more stories that explore the dark corners of human nature and the light that eventually finds its way in.